1975. The mansion sat empty on Wisconsin Avenue in Milwaukee. The Archbishop had moved to modern quarters on the city's north side, and the building that had once housed one of America's great brewing fortunes now gathered dust behind locked doors. 83 years after it opened, 37 rooms paneled in 37 different species of wood from around the world stood vacant. The terracotta ornaments that had cost a fortune in 1892 needed repair. The art glass windows, some by Tiffany, caught sunlight that nobody saw. Real estate developers drove past and saw a parking lot. Preservationists looked at the same building and saw Milwaukee's last surviving monument to the beer barons who had built the city. The question was, which vision would win? The mansion had cost Frederick Pabst $254,000 to construct. His family had lived in it for 16 years before selling it to the Catholic Church for $85,000, a loss of 67%. The church had maintained it for 67 years as the Archbishop's residence, 4 times longer than the Pabsts themselves had occupied it. Now even the clergy were gone, and Milwaukee was trying to decide whether a Flemish Renaissance revival palace built by a Prussian immigrant who made his fortune selling beer was worth saving, or whether the land underneath it was more valuable, empty. Before we continue with Captain Pabst's story, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these stories of forgotten fortunes and the houses they left behind, consider subscribing. New videos explore the mansions that time forgot and the people who built them. Nikolaus Rieth, Thuringia, Prussia. 1848. The boy was 12 when his family fled. Johann Gottlieb Friedrich Pabst, son of a farmer and tavern keeper, left with his parents and siblings in the wave of German immigration that followed the failed revolutions of 1848. They crossed the Atlantic in steerage and arrived in Chicago with little money and no connections. His father, Gottlieb, died shortly after arrival, leaving the family without its primary breadwinner in a country where they barely spoke the language. The Pabsts, already struggling, fell into poverty. Friedrich, as he was known then, went to work. There was no time for school, no opportunity for apprenticeship. He took whatever jobs he could find. He waited tables in German beer halls on the west side. He ran errands for shopkeepers. He swept floors. The work was menial and poorly paid, but it kept the family from starvation. He watched the steamships on Lake Michigan from the Chicago docks and decided that was where he needed to be. The vessels represented movement, distance, escape from the poverty that had defined his first years in America. By the time he was 15 or 16, he had talked his way onto a Great Lakes vessel as a cabin boy. The work was hard and the pay was minimal, but it moved. Friedrich Pabst, who would later insist on being called Frederick and would eventually demand the title captain for the rest of his life, learned to navigate by stars and cargo manifests. He rose through the ranks with the kind of determination that only comes from remembering what hunger feels like. Steward, then mate, then by his early 20s, captain of his own vessel. He became one of the youngest steamship captains on the Great Lakes, commanding passenger and cargo ships across Lake Michigan with a reputation for punctuality and discipline that passengers noticed and shipping companies valued. His vessels departed on time. His cargo arrived intact. His crews followed orders. The maritime life taught him logistics in ways no business school could have matched. How to move goods from one place to another without loss or delay. How to manage crews of men who did not always want to be managed. How to maintain schedules regardless of weather or circumstance. How to calculate profit margins on cargo runs and passenger fares. He was stern, methodical, and almost entirely sober, despite spending his days transporting passengers who often were not. His childhood poverty had taught him that wealth could disappear in an instant. His maritime career taught him that success came from controlling every variable. On April 13, 1862, Frederick Pabst married Maria Best. She was the daughter of Philip Best, who had emigrated from Germany in 1844 and established a small brewery in Milwaukee. It was a love match by all accounts, but it was also the marriage that would change Frederick's life entirely. Maria was 27, intelligent, and deeply involved in her family's business in ways unusual for women of the era. She understood brewing, had grown up around the operations and knew the industry's opportunities and challenges. Her brother Emil was the brewmaster, the technical genius who understood fermentation, ingredients, and the chemistry of beer production. Their father Philip was aging and looking for help with the business side of operations. Frederick knew nothing about brewing. He had never worked in a factory. He had no interest in beer and rarely drank it, a habit formed during childhood when he had watched his father serve alcohol in their tavern and seen what it did to men who lacked discipline. But he understood shipping, distribution, and how to move goods across distances without loss. In 1863, reluctantly, he left his steamship career and joined the best brewing company. He knew nothing about brewing. He knew everything about moving goods from one place to another without loss or delay. It would prove to be exactly the skill the best brewing company needed. By 1873, Philip Best had retired and Frederick Pabst controlled the business. He was 37 years old and about to reinvent American brewing. In 1864, he had become a partner alongside Emil Best, purchasing a stake in the company with savings from his maritime career. 9 years later, with Philip's departure, the operation was effectively his. Emil remained the brewmaster, focused on the quality of the product itself, perfecting recipes and maintaining consistency, batch after batch. But Frederick controlled everything else: strategy, expansion, distribution, marketing, and the innovations that would make Pabst the largest brewery in America. The revolution began with refrigeration. American breweries had always been limited by geography. Beer spoiled quickly in warm weather, which meant most operations could only serve local markets within a day or two of transport. Breweries were neighborhood operations, city operations at best, tied to the communities where they produced. Frederick Pabst invested heavily in refrigerated rail cars, one of the new technologies emerging in the 1870s. The technology was expensive and unproven, but it allowed him to ship beer across the country without spoilage. He established distribution networks in cities thousands of miles from Milwaukee: Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco. He created a national brand before national advertising was common, before most Americans had even heard of brands that weren't local. By 1874, Pabst was the #1 brewery in America by volume, an achievement that astonished the industry. He maintained that position for the next 2 decades through a combination of quality control and marketing genius that was unusual for the era. He was obsessive about consistency in ways that foreshadowed modern manufacturing. He demanded strict sanitation standards in the brewery, controlled every aspect from ingredient sourcing to bottling, and personally inspected operations with a frequency that exhausted his managers. He walked through the facilities unannounced at odd hours. He checked the malting process. He tasted the product at every stage. He examined bottles for defects. He interviewed workers about their methods. He fired workers who failed to meet his standards and rewarded those who exceeded them with bonuses that were generous for the time. The brewing complex in Milwaukee became known for paying well and demanding perfection in return. The marketing breakthrough came in 1876 at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, where Pabst beer won a top prize. The award was not actually a blue ribbon, but a gold medal. But Frederick Pabst saw an opportunity in the public's association between awards and blue ribbons. In 1882, he began tying blue silk ribbons around the necks of his beer bottles as a marketing device. The ribbons cost money, slowed bottling operations, and served no functional purpose. They were pure marketing. Customers associated the blue ribbon with quality, with the Philadelphia Award, with premium product. The gimmick worked so well that quote zero became synonymous with the brand. By 1898, it was officially named Pabst Blue Ribbon, though by then the association was so strong that the formal name change was almost redundant. He built the business through volume. Where other breweries focused on premium pricing and exclusivity, Pabst pursued scale. Economies of scale allowed him to price competitively while maintaining margins, and manufacturers were willing to cut prices for a buyer who could guarantee volume across dozens of distribution locations. He pursued vertical integration with the same methodical determination he had brought to steamship navigation. He owned the malting facilities that processed the grain into malt. He owned the cooperage that made the wooden barrels. He owned the ice houses that kept everything cold before refrigeration technology improved. He owned the distribution network that moved the product from brewery to distributor to retailer. Every stage was controlled, every margin calculated, every inefficiency eliminated. By 1890, Frederick Pabst employed over 1,000 workers in Milwaukee alone. His brewery produced more than 900,000 barrels per year, an astonishing figure that represented millions of bottles of beer consumed across the continent. His personal fortune was estimated between $3 and $5 million, equivalent to somewhere between 100 and 150 million in today's money. He had become one of the wealthiest men in Milwaukee, in a city where wealth was measured in beer. The other brewing families, Schlitz, Miller, Blatz, were building fortunes and mansions at the same time, creating a class of industrial barons who dominated the city's economy and social structure. They competed in business and socialized together. They built mansions along Grand Avenue, each trying to outdo the others in scale and elegance. Frederick Pabst, the immigrant steamship captain who had married into the business and barely drank his own product, stood among them as an equal. By 1890, he had the largest brewery in America, a fortune that exceeded anything he had imagined on those steamship decks, and a growing conviction that he needed to build something that would last longer than beer. Grand Avenue, Milwaukee, 1890. Frederick Pabst purchased the corner lot at what would become 2000 Wisconsin Avenue and hired George Bowman Ferry to design something that would outlast them both. Ferry was born in Michigan in 1851, had trained as an architect in the 1870s under established firms in Detroit and Chicago, and by the late 1880s had become one of Wisconsin's most prominent designers of elaborate residences for the industrial elite. He understood how to create buildings that made statements, that announced wealth without vulgarity, that claimed cultural legitimacy for clients whose fortunes were new. Pabst wanted a statement. He chose Flemish Renaissance revival as the architectural style, a deliberate reference to the 16th century guild halls and merchant palaces of Antwerp and Bruges. The style carried multiple meanings, all of them intentional. It referenced his German heritage and the brewing culture of Northern Europe, where beer had been produced for centuries by craftsmen who took pride in their work. It claimed cultural sophistication and ties to old-world craftsmanship, positioning Pabst not as a nouveau riche industrialist, but as heir to a tradition. It distinguished his home from the typical American Victorian mansions that lined other streets in Milwaukee, with their turrets and gingerbread and decorative excess. Most importantly, it declared permanence. Flemish architecture was associated with merchant dynasties that had lasted centuries, families whose names were carved in stone above doorways that opened for 10 generations. Pabst, who had come to America with nothing and built an empire on 5-cent beer, was claiming membership in that tradition. Construction began in 1890 and took 2 years. The exterior was pressed brick and cream color, specially manufactured for the project to Pabst's specifications. Elaborate terracotta ornamentation covered the facade, with decorative elements that had to be custom-made by specialist craftsmen. The roofline was steep and gabled in the Flemish style, topped with ornate iron cresting that caught light and added vertical interest. Multicolored slate tiles created patterns across the roof, laid in designs that referenced European architectural traditions. The foundation and accent elements were stone quarried in Wisconsin. Everything was chosen for durability and effect. Pabst intended the building to stand for centuries. The defining feature appeared inside. 37 different species of wood throughout the interior. American woods included oak, cherry, maple, and birch, harvested from forests across the Midwest and East. Exotic imports came from around the world. Mahogany shipped from Honduras and the Caribbean, rosewood from Brazil, satinwood from Sri Lanka, zebra wood from West Africa. Each major room featured a different primary wood, creating distinct atmospheres and demonstrating the global reach of Pabst's resources. The library was paneled in one species, the dining room in another, the music room in a third. The variety was not random. It was a demonstration of wealth, global reach, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Pabst traveled to Europe multiple times during construction to source materials personally, visiting lumber merchants in London, cabinet makers in Brussels, and woodworkers in Hamburg. He hired both local Milwaukee artisans and imported European craftsmen who specialized in woodworking. German, Flemish, and American workers carved panels, constructed coffered ceilings, and created decorative friezes throughout the house. The scale was extraordinary. 20,000 square feet across 3 main stories, plus basement and attic. 37 rooms, though the exact count varied depending on how service spaces were classified. 14 fireplaces, each with unique design and materials. Marble mantels with carved ornaments depicting flowers, mythological figures, and abstract patterns. Decorative tile surrounds in blues, greens, and earth tones. Several featured elaborate overmantels with mirrors and additional carvings that extended nearly to the ceiling. The grand staircase rose 3 stories through the center of the house, carved from dark oak with intricate newel posts and balusters that demonstrated the woodcarver's skill. Natural light filtered down from art glass windows positioned on each landing, including multiple panels by Tiffany and other prominent glass studios. The windows appeared throughout the house, featuring natural motifs of flowers and vines, geometric patterns in jewel tones, and abstract designs strategically placed for light effects that changed throughout the day. The mansion was fully electrified, an unusual luxury in 1892, when most homes still relied primarily on gas lighting. Combination gas and electric fixtures provided backup in case the new electrical system failed, which it did periodically in those early years. Central heating operated through an advanced hot air furnace system in the basement, with ducts and registers throughout the house. Indoor plumbing brought hot running water to multiple bathrooms, another rarity in an era when most families still relied on chamber pots and hip baths. Electric servant call buttons appeared in every major room, allowing family members to summon staff without shouting or searching. The ventilation system was sophisticated for its time, with transom windows, air shafts, and carefully designed airflow. Nearly every decorative element was custom-made for the house. No mass-produced architectural elements appeared anywhere. Each room was treated as a unique artistic composition, with woodwork, plasterwork, lighting, and furnishings designed to create a cohesive effect. The music room featured ornate decorative plasterwork designed for acoustics, with surfaces shaped to enhance sound quality when Maria played the piano. The dining room had a massive carved buffet built into the wall, a piece of furniture so large it was essentially architecture. Decorative embossed and painted leather wall coverings surrounded the dining table. An elaborate chandelier hung over the table, which could seat 16 to 20 guests comfortably. The construction cost $254,000. Furnishings and interior decoration added another $50,000 to $75,000. The total investment approached or exceeded $300,000, equivalent to roughly $10 million in today's money. Goldman Sachs would have refused to finance it had Pabst asked, but he did not ask. He paid cash, writing checks as construction progressed, never borrowing, never mortgaging. The house opened in 1892. Frederick Pabst was 56 years old. He had 12 years left, and he would spend most of them in those 37 different woods, believing he had built something permanent. Maria Pabst managed a household staff of 12. The butler supervised the maids, the cook planned dinners for 20, and the coachman kept the carriages ready for the captain's unpredictable schedule. The mansion, during its golden years, operated with the precision Frederick Pabst had learned on steamships. Everyone had a role. Everyone performed it exactly. The housekeeper managed the housemaids who cleaned the 37 rooms, tended the 14 fireplaces, and maintained the elaborate woodwork that required different treatments for different species. Oak needed one type of polish, mahogany needed another. Satinwood was delicate and required careful handling. The staff learned these distinctions or were replaced by those who could. The laundress washed, ironed, and mended the household linens and clothing. Victorian households generated enormous amounts of laundry, with men's shirts requiring starching and pressing, women's dresses needing careful handling of delicate fabrics, and table linens that had to be spotless for formal dinners. The kitchen assistant worked under the cook in the basement kitchen, a Victorian-era practice that kept cooking smells and heat away from the formal rooms above. The groundskeeper maintained the exterior gardens and lawns, which were formal Victorian landscapes with flower beds, manicured lawns, and walking paths. The coachman managed the horses, carriages, and carriage house, keeping everything ready for the captain's trips to the brewery or Maria's social calls. Some staff lived in third-floor quarters, small rooms under the eaves with sloped ceilings and minimal decoration. Others commuted daily from their own homes in Milwaukee's working-class neighborhoods on the south side and near the brewery. Most were German or Irish immigrants, like the captain himself, working their way up through an economy dominated by families who had arrived a generation earlier. The pay was decent by Milwaukee standards. The work was hard but steady. Employment in the Pabst household was considered desirable. Frederick and Maria had 12 children, though sources vary on how many survived to adulthood. Victorian-era infant mortality was high even among the wealthy. By 1892, several were adults with their own families and homes. The younger children still lived in the mansion, occupying bedrooms on the second floor. The mansion served as headquarters for the extended Pabst clan. Grandchildren visited frequently, running through corridors that echoed with their noise. Sunday dinners gathered multiple generations around the dining room table, with Maria at one end and Frederick at the other, children and grandchildren arranged along the sides. Wedding receptions for children used the music room and parlor, connected by pocket doors that could open to create a larger entertaining space. The captain walked his daughters down the grand staircase in wedding dresses purchased in Chicago or New York. The captain maintained a strict daily schedule that varied little from day to day. He rose early, dressed in dark suits that he wore regardless of season, and worked from a home office in the morning, reviewing reports from the brewery that had been delivered the previous evening. Production numbers, sales figures, distribution updates, personnel issues. He read everything, made notes in margins, and sent instructions back with messengers. A carriage took him to the brewing complex around midday for inspections and meetings. He walked through the facilities, observing operations, asking questions, making workers nervous with his presence. He returned for formal evening dinners in the dining room at precisely 6 o'clock, where Maria presided over meals that reinforced both family bonds and social position. Conversation was expected. Children were taught to discuss current events, books they had read, observations about the city. Frederick listened more than he spoke, but paid attention to everything. After dinner, Maria often played piano in the music room, performing pieces by Chopin and Brahms that she had learned as a girl. The captain sat in the library, surrounded by carved wood and his collection of books and art objects he had acquired during European travels. Business associates who dined with the family remember him as formal, intelligent, and somewhat intimidating. His grandchildren remember him as distant but not unkind. The social calendar mixed business entertainment and family events with careful attention to propriety and purpose. Quarterly dinners brought distributors and business partners to the mansion. These were working events disguised as social occasions. The captain used these evenings to reinforce relationships that kept Pabst beer flowing across America, to gather information about markets and competitors, to demonstrate the solidity of his operations. He entertained bankers and investors who held loans to other businesses he controlled beyond the brewery. He hosted beer industry colleagues, including the other brewing families who were simultaneously competitors and neighbors. The Schlitzes lived 2 blocks away. The Millers had a mansion of comparable size. The Blatzes entertained in their own elaborate home. They competed in business and in society, each family trying to establish itself as the preeminent brewing dynasty in Milwaukee. Politicians with connections to brewing interests received invitations. State senators, Milwaukee aldermen, county officials who controlled liquor licenses and regulated brewing operations. The entertainment was never crude. Frederick Pabst understood that elected officials needed to maintain appearances. The gatherings were respectable, the conversations careful, the influence subtle. Milwaukee society came for musical evenings and formal dinner parties that had no business purpose beyond social positioning. The Pabsts were new money in a city where old money barely existed, but they were establishing themselves as the new aristocracy. Holiday celebrations gathered extended family. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter brought children, grandchildren, Maria's siblings, Frederick's surviving relatives. The house was designed for this. The scale of the rooms, the quality of the finishes, the careful placement of each decorative element created an environment that announced success without vulgarity and wealth without apology. Guests included the Schlitz family, the Miller family, and the Blatz family, the other beer barons who had built similar, though not quite as elaborate mansions along the same street. Wisconsin political figures appeared regularly, including governors and United States senators when they visited Milwaukee. Business associates traveled from across America to see the brewery and dine at the mansion. European visitors connected to the brewing industry made Milwaukee a stop on their American tours and often dined at the Pabst mansion, marveling at what a German immigrant had built in less than 30 years. By 1900, the house ran like the brewery, precisely expensively, without apparent effort. The captain was 64 years old. He had 4 years left, and the mansion's golden age would end with him. January 1st, 1904. Frederick Pabst died at the mansion, age 67, surrounded by family in 37 different woods. The cause was heart failure, the cumulative effect of decades of relentless work and a constitution that had never fully recovered from the poverty of his immigrant childhood. He had complained of fatigue in recent months but refused to slow down. On New Year's Eve, he attended a family gathering at the mansion. He retired early. He died during the night in the bedroom where he had slept since the house opened 12 years earlier. He was buried in Forest Home Cemetery in Milwaukee, in a plot he had purchased years before. The funeral was enormous. The brewery closed for the day. Thousands of workers attended. Milwaukee's business and political elite filled the chapel. He left a massive brewing empire, extensive real estate holdings throughout the city, and a fortune that made his heirs among the wealthiest families in Wisconsin. Maria continued living in the mansion. She maintained the household staff and her social position. She received visitors in the parlor where she and Frederick had entertained together. She played the piano in the music room where musical evenings had been a fixture of their marriage, though less frequently now and never for large audiences. But the house without Frederick was different. The driving force was gone. The captain had been the reason for the mansion, the justification for its scale, the personality that filled its rooms. Without him, it felt too large, too elaborate, too much. Maria's health declined through 1905. She was 70 years old and had spent 44 years married to a man whose energy had exhausted everyone around him. On March 20th, 1906, just over 2 years after her husband's death, she died at age 71. She joined Frederick at Forest Home Cemetery. The house passed to their children. None of them wanted it. The decision seems to have been made quickly, though the exact details remain unclear in historical records. The children met at the mansion in the months after Maria's death to discuss the estate. The brewery would continue under family control. Real estate would be divided. Personal property would be distributed. But the mansion presented a problem. The children were adults with their own established homes. Several had families and had built or purchased houses in other neighborhoods. None wanted the burden of maintaining a 37-room mansion with a staff of 12 and operating costs that consumed thousands of dollars annually. Heating the house during Wisconsin winters was expensive. Property taxes were substantial. The staff required salaries. Maintenance on a building filled with exotic materials and custom craftsmanship was constant. The neighborhood was changing. Grand Avenue, which had been exclusively residential when Frederick built the mansion, was beginning to see commercial development. Office buildings were appearing. Apartment buildings were being constructed nearby. The automobile was changing how wealthy families lived, making suburbs accessible in ways they had not been in 1892. The era of elaborate private palaces for single families was ending, though nobody quite acknowledged it yet. Most importantly, the mansion represented their parents' generation. Frederick and Maria's vision of a dynasty headquarters where multiple generations would gather was already obsolete. The children had their own lives, their own homes, their own visions of how to live. They did not want to inhabit their father's monument. The children kept the house for 2 years while arranging a sale. Staff maintained it minimally. Furniture was cataloged. Family members took pieces they wanted. The rest was prepared for disposition. In 1908, 16 years after it opened, the Pabst family sold the mansion. The buyer was the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Milwaukee. The price was approximately $85,000 to $90,000, depending on which source you consult. The figure represented a loss of 67% from the construction cost alone, not counting furnishings and 16 years of maintenance and operating expenses. The building was economically obsolete before its builder was coaled in the ground. The Archdiocese converted the mansion into the official residence of the Milwaukee Archbishop. This decision, made for practical and symbolic reasons that had nothing to do with preservation, saved the building. The church needed a residence for its bishop that reflected the archdiocese's importance and provided appropriate space for ecclesiastical functions. The mansion offered 37 rooms, multiple reception areas, and a location that was prominent without being ostentatious. Religious use preserved the architectural integrity that a conversion to apartments or commercial space would have destroyed. The church modified some spaces for ecclesiastical purposes. Several bedrooms on the second floor became offices for diocesan administration, with desks and filing cabinets replacing beds and wardrobes. A chapel may have been added in one of the first-floor rooms, though documentation is unclear and later modifications may have removed it. Institutional furniture replaced the original Pabst pieces, which had been dispersed when the family sold the house. The formal dining room table was sold. The parlor furniture disappeared. The bedroom suites were broken up. Heavy, practical furniture appropriate to institutional use replaced Victorian elegance. The gardens were simplified for easier maintenance. Formal flower beds became lawns. The carriage house was eventually demolished, though the exact date is not recorded. But the woodwork remained untouched. All 37 species stayed in place, maintained by church staff who understood their value, if not their original significance. The archbishop and his staff may not have known which wood was which, but they knew the paneling was extraordinary and should not be damaged. The art glass windows were protected. The decorative plasterwork, the 14 fireplaces, the carved ceilings, the grand staircase, everything that made the mansion architecturally significant survived 67 years of church ownership intact. Successive Milwaukee archbishops lived there from 1908 through 1975. Each made minor modifications for comfort and function. But none gutted the building or removed its defining features. The irony was obvious to anyone who thought about it. A beer baron's mansion, built with profits from alcohol, was preserved by an institution officially opposed to excess and intemperance. Frederick Pabst, who barely drank his own product, would have appreciated the contradiction. By the early 1970s, the economics that had driven the Pabst children to sell in 1908 had returned with even greater force. Operating expenses were prohibitive. Heating oil prices had increased. Utility costs had climbed. Property taxes reflected the building's size and prominent location. The building was far too large for a single archbishop's needs. Modern archbishops did not entertain on the scale that Frederick Pabst had. They did not need 37 rooms. Maintenance costs for an aging historic structure were escalating. Systems installed in the 1920s and 30s needed replacement. The roof leaked in places. Plaster was cracking. Woodwork needed conservation that the church could not afford. The archdiocese had other priorities for its resources. Urban ministry, schools, and social programs needed funding more than an elaborate residence needed preservation. The decision was made at the diocesan level. The archbishop would move to smaller modern quarters better suited to contemporary needs. In 1975, the archbishop moved out. The mansion sat empty on Wisconsin Avenue, 75 years after it opened, having outlived both its original purpose and its ecclesiastical tenant, and nobody knew what to do with it. While the mansion passed from the Pabsts to the archbishop and then sat empty waiting for its next life, the brewing company that had paid for all those exotic woods was facing its own crisis, one that would eventually explain why the family never came back for the house. After Frederick's death in 1904, his sons took over management. Gustav Pabst became president, leading the company through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The company continued successfully under family control through the 1910s, maintaining its position as America's largest brewery by volume. Production exceeded 900,000 barrels annually, approaching 1 million in good years. Employment remained over 1,000 workers in the Milwaukee complex alone. The distribution network Frederick had built with refrigerated rail cars continued functioning across the country. Sales remained strong. Profits continued. The Pabst family remained wealthy, though they were no longer accumulating fortune at the rate Frederick had managed during his prime years. Competition had intensified. Other breweries had adopted the innovations Frederick had pioneered. The market was more crowded. But the real threat was not competition. The temperance movement that had been building since the late 19th century was gaining political power. The Women's Christian Temperance Union organized in cities across America. The Anti-Saloon League lobbied state legislatures. Churches preached against alcohol. Progressive reformers connected alcohol to poverty, crime, and family dissolution. State after state passed prohibition laws. By 1919, enough states had ratified the 18th Amendment to make it law. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, banning the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the entire nation. Prohibition arrived, and Pabst Brewing Company, the largest beer producer in America, was suddenly illegal. The impact was immediate and devastating. The massive brewing complex in Milwaukee, which had operated continuously since the 1840s, went silent. Copper kettles that had boiled wort for decades stood cold. Fermentation tanks were emptied and cleaned. Bottling lines stopped. Over 1,000 workers lost their jobs or saw their hours reduced to skeleton maintenance crews that kept the buildings from deteriorating. The family fortune, built on beer, faced extinction. The irony was extraordinary and bitter. A company founded by a man who barely drank alcohol was being destroyed by a law banning alcohol. Frederick Pabst had been personally abstemious. He had built an empire on a product he rarely consumed. Now that product was illegal. Pabst survived Prohibition through a combination of desperation and creativity. The company produced, quote, a low-alcohol beverage that contained less than 0.5% alcohol and was therefore legal under Prohibition laws. They marketed it as, quote, though nobody was fooled about what it really was or why anyone would buy it. Near beer tasted terrible. It sold poorly, but it kept the brand name visible and provided minimal revenue. They converted some brewing facilities to cheese manufacturing. The equipment used for brewing could be adapted to dairy processing. Pabst cheese appeared in markets across the Midwest, sold under the brewing company's name. It was profitable enough to justify the operation, but nowhere near beer's margins. They sold malt syrup, which was legally marketed for baking, but everyone understood was actually for home brewing. Home brewing was technically illegal during Prohibition, but enforcement was inconsistent, and public compliance was low. Millions of Americans brewed beer in their basements using malt syrup from companies like Pabst. The sales were legal. What customers did with the product was theoretically their problem. They leased brewery buildings to other businesses. The massive complex had space for warehousing, light manufacturing, and other operations that needed large buildings with good railroad access. The rent helped offset property taxes and maintenance costs. They maintained a skeleton crew and waited for repeal, betting that the political tide would eventually turn. Gustav Pabst and his siblings believed Prohibition would fail. American culture would not permanently accept alcohol bans. The question was how long they could hold out. The financial losses were catastrophic. The Pabst family wealth, accumulated over 50 years of brewing dominance, eroded throughout the 1920s. Real estate investments and diversification prevented complete ruin. The family still owned property throughout Milwaukee. They had investments in other businesses, but the core business that had generated the fortune was gone. The brewery that had justified the mansion was silent. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. Pabst resumed beer production immediately. Workers returned, though in smaller numbers than before. The brewing complex restarted. Beer flowed again. But the company never fully regained its pre-Prohibition dominance. The 13 years of shutdown had allowed other breweries, particularly those that had maintained operations through creative legal interpretations or had simply resumed faster, to capture market share. Anheuser-Busch had survived Prohibition better than Pabst. Miller had used the years well. National brands from other cities had established themselves in territories Pabst once controlled. The competition was more intense and better financed than it had been in Frederick's era. Marketing required radio advertising, billboards, national campaigns that demanded budgets the family had not anticipated. Through the 1940s and 50s, the Pabst family gradually sold controlling interest in the company. The decision was made incrementally, share by share, but the direction was clear. By the mid-1950s, no Pabst controlled Pabst Brewing Company. The name remained, but the dynasty had ended. Corporate owners bought and sold the brand through the following decades, treating it as an asset rather than a legacy. Pabst Blue Ribbon became a working-class beer, losing the premium positioning Frederick had carefully cultivated. The brand declined in value and prestige. Marketing budgets shrank, production volumes fell. The beer remained recognizable, but not prestigious. In 1996, Pabst closed its historic Milwaukee brewery. The massive complex that had employed thousands and produced millions of barrels of beer over more than a century shut down permanently. Production moved to contract brewers in other cities. Most of the buildings were demolished, leaving empty lots where Frederick Pabst's empire had stood. Some were preserved as historic structures, converted to offices and apartments, but beer production in Milwaukee ended. The symbolic weight was crushing. Milwaukee, which had been built on brewing, lost its connection to the industry that had defined it for over a century. The Pabst name survived. The brand still exists today. Owned by an investment group with no connection to the family, Pabst Blue Ribbon is produced under contract at various breweries across the country. The beer has found ironic cachet with younger consumers who appreciate its working-class associations and retro appeal. But nobody involved has any connection to Frederick Pabst or his descendants. The name on the bottle is the last trace of the man who built the mansion. When the last beer left the Milwaukee brewery in 1996, the Pabst Mansion had been a museum for 18 years. The house had outlasted the company. Neither belonged to the family anymore. 1975. The mansion sat empty. The Archbishop had moved to modern quarters on the city's north side, and the Archdiocese listed the property for sale without restrictions on its use. The listing attracted no serious buyers. The building was structurally sound, but had significant deferred maintenance from recent years. Water damage had affected plaster in several rooms where roof leaks had gone unrepaired. The electrical system was obsolete and potentially dangerous, with knob and tube wiring from the 1920s still in use in some areas. The heating system barely functioned. The old furnace wheezed and clanked, but delivered inconsistent heat. The roof needed repair in multiple locations. Gardens that had once been formal Victorian landscapes were overgrown and simplified. Weeds grew in flower beds. Trees needed pruning. The lawn was mowed but not maintained to the standards the Pabsts would have demanded. The carriage house was gone, demolished sometime during the church's ownership when maintaining it became too expensive. The property had been reduced in size from the original lot, as surrounding parcels were sold off for development. What had once been spacious grounds were now a fraction of their original extent, but the defining architectural features remained intact. All 37 woods were still in place, though some needed conservation work. Panels had dried out and split in places where humidity control had failed. Finishes were dirty from decades of accumulated grime, but the wood itself survived. The art glass windows survived, including the Tiffany panels that were now worth fortunes individually. The carved ceilings, the decorative plasterwork, the 14 unique fireplaces, the grand 3-story staircase, everything that made the mansion significant was still there, waiting for someone to decide it was worth preserving. Nobody stepped forward. The economics were brutal and simple. The building was too large for any single family to occupy as a residence. Who needed 37 rooms? Even wealthy families in the 1970s did not live that way. Servants were expensive and hard to find. Heating costs were enormous. The maintenance was constant. Converting it to apartments would require gutting the interior and destroying everything that made it valuable. You cannot divide 37 rooms paneled in exotic woods into efficient apartment units without destroying the paneling. Commercial conversion faced the same problem. The woodwork, the art glass, the carved ceilings, all the features that made the mansion significant also made it nearly impossible to adapt for modern commercial use. The location on Wisconsin Avenue, once prestigious, was now a mix of commercial and residential development that made the mansion feel out of place. The avenue had become a busy urban street. Traffic noise was constant. The surrounding context that had made sense in 1892 no longer existed. Operating the building for any purpose would require massive investment in systems upgrades, code compliance, and ongoing maintenance, modern electrical systems to current standards, plumbing repairs and updates, HVAC systems for climate control. fire suppression systems required by building codes, accessibility modifications required by recent laws. Property taxes were substantial based on the building's size. Insurance would be expensive given the age of the structure and the value of its architectural features. The most logical economic use for the property was demolition. The land underneath the mansion was worth more empty than occupied. A parking lot would generate steady income with minimal maintenance. Property taxes on a parking lot were lower than on an elaborate building. A small commercial building would be even more profitable. A bank branch, offices, retail space, any of these would generate more revenue than a mansion that was too expensive to maintain and impossible to adapt. Milwaukee had demolished other comparable mansions in the 1960s and 70s for exactly these reasons. Grand Avenue's other beer baron palaces had fallen one by one to parking lots and commercial development. The Schlitz mansion was gone. Others had disappeared. Each demolition made it easier to justify the next. If those buildings were not worth saving, why was the Pabst mansion different? The architectural significance was not immediately obvious to developers looking at operating costs and return on investment. The Pabst mansion appeared destined for the same fate. Through 1976 and 1977, the building sat empty while the Archdiocese tried to find a buyer willing to preserve it. Each passing season made restoration more expensive. Winter weather in Wisconsin is harsh, and an unheated building deteriorates faster than an occupied one. Water infiltration increased as roof problems worsened. Plaster cracked as the building froze and thawed without climate control. Woodwork dried out and split without proper humidity levels. The gardens became more overgrown. Vandalism became a concern, though the building's visibility on a major street provided some protection. Local teenagers did not break windows or spray graffiti because the mansion was too prominent, too visible to police patrols. But the threat was there. Media coverage highlighted the threat. Milwaukee newspapers ran stories about the abandoned mansion, usually illustrated with photographs showing the building's impressive facade and noting that its future was uncertain. Historic preservation advocates in Milwaukee recognized the mansion's significance and sounded alarms, but alarm is not the same as solution. Preservation groups held meetings. Architects wrote letters to the editor. Historians gave interviews about the building's importance. Community awareness was high, but awareness does not pay for maintenance or provide a sustainable operating model. The mansion needed someone to buy it, restore it, and figure out how to operate it long-term without losing money every year. No individual with sufficient wealth stepped forward. Milwaukee had wealthy families in the 1970s, but none wanted the burden of saving someone else's monument. No institution with appropriate mission and resources emerged. Museums had their own buildings. Universities had their own properties. Historical societies had no money. No government agency took responsibility. The city of Milwaukee was facing budget pressures and could not justify purchasing an expensive building it had no clear use for. The state of Wisconsin had no mechanism for preserving private residences. Historic preservation laws at the time did not protect private residences to the degree they would in later decades. The building could be demolished legally and easily if a buyer wanted the land. By the spring of 1978, the mansion had been empty for 3 years. It had survived Frederick Pabst's death, the family's abandonment, 67 years of archbishops, and Prohibition's destruction of the brewing empire. It would not survive much longer without someone deciding it was worth saving. A group of Milwaukee citizens who had never met Frederick Pabst decided his mansion was worth saving. They formed a nonprofit organization in 1978 specifically to purchase, restore, and operate the building as a public museum. The group called itself Captain Frederick Pabst Mansion, Incorporated, later renamed Wisconsin Heritages, Incorporated, when the organization expanded its mission. The members were historians, preservation advocates, and community members who recognized that Milwaukee was losing its architectural heritage building by building, and that the Pabst Mansion represented something that could not be replaced once demolished. They included local architects who understood the building's significance, retired professionals who had time to volunteer, historians who had documented Milwaukee's brewing heritage, and community activists who wanted to preserve what made the city distinctive. They had no endowment. They had no wealthy patron providing startup capital. They had no government support guaranteeing operational funding. What they had was conviction that the building mattered and willingness to attempt something that might fail. They negotiated with the Archdiocese through 1978. The conversations were delicate. The church needed to sell the property and recover some value from decades of ownership and maintenance. The preservation group needed a price they could afford and terms that would give them time to raise funds. The church, to its credit, was willing to work with preservationists rather than simply selling to the highest bidder. Archdiocesan officials recognized that the building had significance beyond its monetary value. They were willing to accept less money if it meant the mansion would be preserved. In 1978, Wisconsin Heritages Incorporated purchased the mansion for approximately $60,000 to $65,000, depending on which source you consult. The figure was extraordinarily low by any measure. The original construction cost in the 1890s had been $254,000. The 1908 sale to the Archdiocese had been $85,000. The 1978 sale was $60,000, meaning the building had lost 76% of its value in 86 years. The economic obsolescence was complete. The Archdiocese accepted a below-market offer because the purchaser committed to preservation. The church chose preservation over profit, a decision that deserves recognition and probably saved the building. Wisconsin Heritages took possession of a building that needed everything. The immediate priorities were stabilization and safety. The roof required emergency repairs to stop water infiltration that was damaging plaster and woodwork. Contractors tarped problem areas while more permanent repairs were planned. The building needed to be secured against weather and potential vandalism. Doors were reinforced, windows were checked and secured. Broken panes were replaced. Electrical systems had to be evaluated and upgraded to basic safety standards. An electrician inspected the wiring and declared portions of it dangerous. Temporary repairs made the building safe enough to occupy. Permanent upgrades would come later. Temporary heating had to be installed to prevent freeze damage during Wisconsin winters. Without heat, pipes would burst and woodwork would be destroyed by moisture and temperature fluctuations. The organization had limited funds and no revenue stream beyond what they could raise through appeals and small donations from supporters. The solution was to open to the public immediately, even before full restoration. Limited tours began in 1979, generating modest revenue and building public support. Visitors walked through rooms that were empty of furniture but still displayed the architectural magnificence that made the building worth saving. Tour guides, mostly volunteers at first, explained the building's history and pointed out features. The 37 different woods, even without conservation treatment, demonstrated the level of craftsmanship Frederick Pabst had demanded. Each room still showed its distinct character. The art glass windows still glowed when sunlight hit them. The carved ceiling still impressed. The grand staircase still rose 3 stories through the center of the house. People could see what was at stake. Word spread. Media coverage became more positive. Milwaukee residents who had read about the threatened demolition came to see what had been saved. Tour revenue grew slowly but steadily. Through the early 1980s, restoration proceeded room by room as funding allowed. The woodwork required specialized conservation. 37 different species meant 37 different treatments. Each wood responded differently to humidity, temperature, and age. Oak was relatively stable. Mahogany could be temperamental. Exotic woods like zebra wood required careful handling by specialists who understood their properties. Some panels needed consolidation where they had cracked or split, a delicate process involving adhesives and careful clamping. Others needed careful cleaning to remove decades of grime without damaging the finish. The wrong cleaning product could strip finish or discolor wood. Specialists were brought in to assess each room and develop appropriate conservation approaches. The decorative plasterwork was repaired by craftsmen who understood historical techniques. Modern patching materials would have been visible and inappropriate. The restoration used traditional methods and materials matched to the original. Lime plaster, not modern joint compound. Traditional pigments, not modern paints. The work was slow and expensive but produced results that were invisible when done correctly. The art glass windows were conserved panel by panel. Some required structural repair where lead came had failed and glass pieces had become loose. Others needed cleaning that removed a century of dirt while preserving the delicate glass and maintaining the painted details on some pieces. The work was done by glass conservators who specialized in historic windows. The exterior masonry was cleaned and repaired. Terracotta ornaments that had deteriorated were stabilized where possible or carefully reproduced, using molds made from surviving examples where necessary. The organization began acquiring period-appropriate furnishings to create room interpretations. Some original Pabst family pieces were returned by descendants who had inherited them or acquired from collectors who had purchased them at estate sales decades earlier. Others were Victorian-era pieces appropriate to the 1890s period, but not specifically from the Pabst household. Antique dealers helped locate appropriate furniture. Donors contributed pieces that fit the period. The goal was not complete reconstruction of the original interiors, which would have been impossible since most furnishings had been dispersed in 1908 and no comprehensive inventory existed, but rather creation of period room settings that helped visitors understand how the mansion had functioned during its golden era. Grant applications brought funding from preservation organizations that recognized the mansion's significance. The National Trust for Historic Preservation provided grants. State historic preservation programs contributed. Foundation grants supported specific projects. Private donations from Milwaukee residents and former visitors sustained day-to-day operations. Special events and fundraising campaigns targeted specific projects. The work was slow and never-ending, but progress was visible. Each completed room brought more visitors. Each visitor potentially became a donor or member. In 1978, the same year Wisconsin Heritages purchased the building, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The federal recognition acknowledged the mansion's architectural significance and its role in Milwaukee's brewing history. The nomination documented the building's history, its architectural features, and its importance to the city's development. National Register status made the property eligible for certain grants and tax incentives that helped fund restoration work. It raised the profile nationally among preservation communities. Preservation professionals across the country learned about the Pabst Mansion. It provided official validation that the building mattered beyond Milwaukee. The mansion also received Milwaukee Historic Landmark designation, providing local recognition and some protections under city ordinances. By 1985, visitors could walk through rooms where Captain Pabst had counted his nickels and planned his empire. The 37 woods were stabilized, the art glass glowed again, and the house that had nearly become a parking lot was beginning its second life. 40 years after Wisconsin Heritages purchased the mansion, tours run year-round. Visitors walk across floors where Maria Pabst directed her staff, climb the grand staircase that once led to the captain's bedroom, and stand in rooms paneled with 37 different woods from around the world. The building operates as a house museum, maintained and interpreted by Wisconsin Heritages, Incorporated, the same nonprofit organization that saved it in 1978. Regular guided tours are offered throughout the year with varying schedules depending on season and demand. Summer brings more tourists. December brings visitors for Victorian Christmas tours. Spring and fall attract steady crowds. Visitors see the architectural features that make the mansion significant. The exotic woods throughout every major room, each species carefully identified and explained by tour guides who have learned to distinguish oak from cherry from mahogany from zebra wood. The art glass windows, including Tiffany panels, positioned to create light effects that change throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky. The 14 fireplaces, each with unique design and materials that demonstrate the range of choices available to a wealthy builder in the 1890s. The carved ceilings with their coffered panels and decorative rosettes that required months of skilled labor to create. The grand 3-story staircase that serves as the central focal point and allows visitors to see how the house was organized vertically. And the decorative plasterwork that covers walls and ceilings throughout the house. From simple cornices to elaborate ceiling medallions, the rooms are furnished with Victorian-era pieces that create period settings appropriate to the 1890s. Some items belong to the Pabst family and have been returned to the house through donations from descendants or purchases from collectors. Others are period-appropriate pieces that represent the kind of furnishings a wealthy brewing family would have owned, acquired from antique dealers and auction houses over decades of collecting. The interpretation emphasizes the architecture and craftsmanship rather than attempting complete reconstruction of specific rooms as they appeared in Frederick's lifetime, which would be impossible given how little documentation survives about the original furnishing plans and how many original pieces have been lost. Tour guides explain Frederick Pabst's biography, from Prussian immigrant to steamship captain to brewing magnate. They describe the construction process, the selection of materials, and the decision to use 37 different wood species. They discuss Milwaukee's brewing history and the beer baron era when families like the Pabsts, Schlitzes, Millers, and Blatzes dominated the city's economy and society, building mansions that announced their success. They explain Victorian domestic life, the roles of servants, the social functions that took place in each room, and how wealthy families in the Gilded Age used architecture to express their position and claim social legitimacy. They tell the preservation story itself, how the building passed from family to church to near demolition to museum, emphasizing how close the mansion came to being demolished and how its survival depended on specific people making specific decisions. The mansion hosts special programs beyond standard tours. Behind-the-scenes tours take visitors into areas not normally accessible, including the third-floor former servant quarters where staff lived, the basement service areas where cooking and laundry took place, and spaces that show how the building functioned operationally rather than just how it looked for entertaining. Architectural focus tours emphasize the building's design and construction techniques for visitors with specific interests in architecture and preservation. Holiday events are particularly popular. Victorian Christmas tours in December draw visitors who want to see the mansion decorated as it might have been during the Pabst family's residence, with period decorations, greenery, and Christmas trees lit with candles as they would have been in the 1890s. The building is rented for events. Weddings take place in the music room and parlor, where pocket doors open to create a larger space suitable for ceremonies and small receptions. Corporate meetings and receptions use the formal rooms for events that benefit from the mansion's elegant setting. These events generate significant revenue that supports operations and conservation work. The fees charged for event rentals help fund the ongoing preservation work that keeps the building open. Educational programs bring school groups to learn about Milwaukee history, Victorian-era life, immigration, and industrial development. Students tour the building and participate in programs designed to teach history through architecture and material culture. The mansion serves as a teaching tool for topics ranging from architecture to social history to economic change. Teachers use the mansion as a resource for lessons about the Gilded Age, immigration, industrialization, and how cities like Milwaukee developed during the late 19th century. Operating a historic house museum requires constant attention and continuous funding. The building's maintenance needs never end. The 37 different wood species require ongoing conservation. Each responds differently to environmental conditions. Climate control is essential but expensive. Temperature and humidity must be managed carefully to prevent damage to the woodwork, plaster, and art glass. Too dry and the wood splits. Too humid and mold develops. Temperature fluctuations cause expansion and contraction that can damage joints and finishes. The systems that provide this control are costly to operate and require periodic replacement. HVAC equipment that keeps the building at stable temperature and humidity uses substantial energy. The equipment itself requires maintenance and eventually needs replacement at costs that run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The exterior demands attention. Wisconsin weather is harsh. Freeze-thaw cycles affect masonry. Water gets into tiny cracks, freezes, expands, and breaks the material. The terracotta ornaments need monitoring and occasional repair. Some pieces deteriorate and need stabilization or careful reproduction. The slate roof requires maintenance. Individual slates crack and need replacement. Flashing fails and needs repair. Water infiltration is an ongoing concern that must be addressed immediately when problems appear. One leak can cause thousands of dollars in damage to interior plaster and woodwork if not caught quickly. Interior systems need updates. Electrical systems must meet modern codes while respecting the historic fabric. Finding ways to bring modern electrical capacity into historic spaces without damaging original features requires careful planning and skilled electricians. Plumbing requires maintenance. Old pipes corrode and leak. Modern plumbing standards require updates that must be integrated carefully. Fire suppression systems protect the building and its contents, but require installation and upkeep that balance safety needs with preservation concerns. Sprinkler systems are needed for insurance and safety, but must be installed in ways that do not damage or obscure historic features. The funding model depends entirely on earned income and voluntary support. Tour admissions provide steady but modest revenue. Admission fees are kept affordable to encourage visitation, which means volume is needed to generate significant income. Event rentals contribute significantly but require staff time and create wear on the building. Every wedding uses the rooms in ways that create maintenance needs. Private donations from supporters sustain day-to-day operations. Individual donors contribute annually to keep the building open. Membership programs create a base of regular contributors who receive benefits like free tours and special events. Grants from foundations and preservation organizations fund specific conservation projects. A grant might fund restoration of particular rooms or conservation of specific art glass windows. Fundraising events supplement other income sources. Galas, benefit concerts, and other events bring in donations beyond the cost of the event itself. The gift shop generates small but helpful revenue by selling books, postcards, and items related to the mansion and Milwaukee history. The mansion receives no government operational funding. It must support itself entirely through these sources, which makes every economic downturn, every decline in tourism, and every shift in visitor patterns a potential threat. Economic recessions reduce donations. Harsh winters reduce visitation. Competition from newer attractions draws potential visitors elsewhere. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated this vulnerability. The mansion closed to visitors in 2020 when the virus made indoor public spaces dangerous. Tours stopped. Event rentals were canceled. Weddings were postponed. The organization lost months of admission revenue and event rentals at a time when operating costs continued. Utilities still had to be paid. Climate control had to be maintained to protect the building, even with no visitors. Staff could not all be laid off because the building still required care. Operations continued with reduced staff and deferred conservation projects. The organization survived through donor support and careful financial management, drawing down reserves and launching emergency fundraising campaigns. But the experience demonstrated how fragile the operating model remains. The mansion continues today because enough people continue to support it financially and through volunteer work. That support is not guaranteed to continue forever. The mansion today represents multiple layers of history. It is the last surviving beer baron mansion in Milwaukee, a city that was once filled with comparable houses built by brewing families. The others were demolished decades ago, making the Pabst mansion irreplaceable as physical evidence of that era. Without the Pabst mansion, Milwaukee would have no way to show visitors what the beer barons built and how they lived. It is a rare intact example of Flemish Renaissance revival residential architecture in America, with architectural features and craftsmanship that cannot be reproduced today. The 37 wood species alone represent a level of material investment and artisanal skill that has no contemporary equivalent. Nobody today would source 37 different woods for a single house. Nobody has the craftsman who could do the carving and finishing. The skills have been lost or are so rare that costs would be astronomical. It documents immigrant achievement and its limits. Frederick Pabst arrived in America as a poor child and built an industrial empire. He created a palace that announced his success and intended to establish a dynasty. The dynasty lasted 16 years in the house and dissolved completely within 2 generations. The building stands as evidence of both what was achieved and how quickly it disappeared. The distance between Frederick's intentions and what actually happened is the entire story of American wealth and its instability. It demonstrates the trajectory of successful historic preservation. The mansion was days or weeks from demolition in 1978. Its survival required specific people making specific decisions at a specific moment. Wisconsin heritages did not exist until citizens decided to form it. The Archdiocese could have sold to a developer. The building could have disappeared. Its continued existence depends on ongoing effort and continuous support. Nothing about its survival was or is inevitable. Historic preservation is not automatic. Buildings survive because people decide they matter and do the work to keep them standing. It serves as an educational resource for topics ranging from architecture to brewing history, to Victorian domestic life, to immigration, to preservation itself. Thousands of visitors annually learn from the building and its interpretation. School groups use it as a teaching tool, bringing children who would otherwise never see Victorian-era craftsmanship or understand how wealthy families lived in the Gilded Age. Researchers study its architecture and history, publishing papers and books that use the mansion as evidence. The building continues to generate knowledge and understanding 46 years after it was saved. Frederick Pabst walked into his completed mansion in 1892, believing he had built something permanent. He had spent $254,000 on construction and perhaps another $75,000 on furnishings. He had sourced 37 different wood species from around the world, traveling to Europe multiple times to find exactly the materials he wanted. He had hired the best craftsmen available, both local Milwaukee artisans and imported European specialists. He had created a Flemish Renaissance revival palace on Milwaukee's most prestigious street, a building designed to last centuries and announce the Pabst family's arrival among America's industrial dynasties. He intended it as the seat of a dynasty that would last generations. His children would live there. His grandchildren would inherit it. The Pabst name would be associated with the address for a century or more, the way European merchant families were tied to their ancestral homes. Great-grandchildren he would never meet would walk the same corridors. The 37 woods would be maintained by descendants who understood they were part of something larger than themselves. He died 12 years after the house opened. His widow lived there 2 more years. His children sold it 16 years after construction, taking a 67% loss and dispersing the contents to antique dealers and family members who wanted souvenirs. The dynasty he intended to found never materialized. The brewing empire that justified the mansion collapsed during Prohibition and was sold to strangers within 50 years of his death. The Milwaukee brewery closed in 1996, ending beer production in the city the Pabsts had helped build. The family name survives on beer bottles produced by contract brewers with no connection to the family, sold to consumers who have never heard of Captain Frederick Pabst and do not know that an actual person stood behind the brand. The house survived, but only barely, and only because people who had no connection to the builder decided it was worth saving when every economic calculation said it should be demolished. The 37 woods are still there, each one requiring different care, different humidity, different attention. Visitors walk past them every day, most not knowing what Frederick Pabst intended when he sourced mahogany from Honduras and zebra wood from West Africa, when he paid craftsmen to carve panels that would take months to complete. He meant to build something that would last forever. He built something that almost didn't last to 1978. The difference between those two outcomes is the entire history of the house.